Hello, Political Science 365 students. Welcome to the final third of this course, and here we're going to be discussing gender and war. In this lecture, I'm going to do a little bit of an intro. I have to keep these fairly short so that I can upload them from my primeval internet connection at home. First, wanted to talk about a few admin things. I see your exams. I haven't graded them yet. And I also have yet to grade your papers. I will turn those around as soon as I can. The next lecture will be on Kashmir. It'll have to do with the reading from She Goes to War. And I will put your discussion question assignment in it. So hopefully I'll upload that tomorrow or by Monday at the latest. If you have any admin type questions, feel free to contact me. If you have any general questions, you can contact me, or you can put them in the discussion board. So, in terms of the study of women in war, it basically comes down to a battle between those who think that gender difference is essential and those who think that it's a social construction. So the essentialists, people who think basically that, the old men are from Mars, women are from Venus stuff, right? They would argue that there's something natural and inherent about being a man that makes you like slugs and snails, be aggressive, think about sex all the time, etc., right? Similarly, they would argue that women are more nurturing, selfless, compassionate, better suited to housework, right? A lot of variations on this theme would talk about women's capacity to bear children and how this affects female psychology, right? So the other major perspective is a constructivist one, and I think that's the one that's most common in academia today, and that is that, basically that gender is make-believe, gender is a social construct, right? And that different people across space and time feel differently about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. So there is another gender gap. Remember in the last section we talked about the gender gap in terms of women voting more to the left than men. So when we talk about gender and war, the gender gap here is that men are much more likely to be in favor of the use of military force than are women in general. Right, and here you see some illustrations from around the world. I think this is the UK, this is Colombia, here's Liberia, right, of women organizing for peace, right? And obviously we're not talking all women, but in general you find more women more in favor of peace. And the question, of course, is why, right? Is it something like the essentialists would say that there's something about being a woman that makes you more peaceful? Is it a guns versus butter argument, right? Remember, we talked about this in terms of the gender gap. One of the reasons why women tend to vote more liberally than men is that they tend to favor the extension of a welfare state, which is associated with the liberal position. So similarly, the expression guns and butter, you may have heard, right? And so a country only has so much money in its budget. Should it give money to guns, military spending, or should it give money to butter, which is shorthand for, food and welfare spending, right? So women usually would be in favor more of the welfare spending than the military spending. Okay, so we know that gender varies across cultures, right? And here I'm not talking about biological sex, whatever that might be, but gender meaning what it is that we understand it to be a woman. So in terms of your sexual expression, in terms of who does the household labor, in terms of who takes care of the children, and I've put here even hunting because the book that I used to assign, it's a little too out of date for me to assign this time around, but it kept talking about hunting is an exception, right? Men only hunt, and that's not true. Women do hunt, and if you look at the animal world, of course, if female animals did not hunt, they would starve to death. I don't know where that nonsense came from, but in any case. So warfare, of course, also varies, right? And different people have different understandings of what it means to have a war. In political science, we typically use the 1,000 dead bodies as required before a skirmish is considered to be a war. Only 999 dead bodies are not enough, right? But that's obviously somewhat arbitrary. So different cultures obviously have different understandings of warfare, different wartime rituals, different fighting techniques, etc. So in terms of the study of gender in war, when I first got into this field in the 90s, there were not a whole lot of women. And who were studying this. The existing scholarship was mostly by women. It was mostly from a feminist perspective. And for the most part, it did not reach into mainstream political science. Right? So things have changed a little bit in international relations and political science. You may occasionally in the mainstream journal see one article here or there. But for the most part, it's relegated to women's studies, conflict studies, etc. And for the most part, they don't pay a whole lot of attention to gender. So I'm going to go through some of the feminist theories about gender and war. And the first one is what I'm calling here liberal feminism. And you can think of it as equality feminism, if you like. So the goal of this type of feminist is for equality of the sexes, right? So basically, they would argue that women should have the same opportunities that men should. And from this perspective, right, you would say basically all the jobs in the military should be open to women. This will help women's empowerment, women's careers, etc. And as you can imagine, this perspective is critiqued both from left and right, but it's critiqued for simply making women act like men, right? So basically, you're giving women the opportunity to be men, woohoo, and it's not about degendering, or I guess I should say deconstructing what it means to be a masculine man or anything like that. There's not really a critique of masculinity. It's just women should be able to be men too, right? Women should be able to be soldiers too. Okay, difference feminism would be the second major strain, and so this is probably borrowing from essentialism here. There are variations on this theme, right? So within the umbrella of difference feminism, one camp is basically summarized as violent men, peaceful women. And when I worked in Croatia during the war for a Bosnian Herzegovinian Mothers Association, the woman who headed the office used to say, women create life and men destroy it. So that would be an example of difference feminism. Right? A second perspective is a little bit more sophisticated, and I've listed it here as autonomous men, connected women. So Gilligan is a psychologist, and she basically writes about how, women's experience of raising children, suckling children, etc., makes them more interconnected, whereas men are more independent and autonomous, right? And so she explains gender difference that way. Ecofeminism is a kind of interesting offshoot here, and so the equation is of woman with the earth and nature and good, right? And then on the other hand, you have the man, you have civilization, you have violence, and you have evil, basically, right? So again, there are variations on that theme, but the common denominator is men go around killing things, women go around giving life and trying to prevent men from killing things. Right? So the goal of difference feminists is to try to transform the war system. Right? They have no interest in whoop-de-doo being able to join, the most elite cadre of the Marines or whatnot. Right? They're basically, what they want is an end to militarism and war. So some critiques of this perspective, first of all, that they overlook women's participation in political violence and militarized gender roles. Some 20 years ago, as an offshoot to my dissertation, after I did research in Rwanda, I wrote an article about the involvement of women in murdering women and children in the Rwanda genocide. And when I wrote about that 20 years ago, it was literally 20 years ago now, nobody was writing about it. And you know what? Nobody's writing about it now either, or very few people are. So, if you look closely, you can find women doing awful acts of violence all the time. And that really does not fit with this theoretical perspective, right? So if women are kinder and gentler by nature, why are women going around smashing babies' brains out in Rwanda? Forgive me for that graphic image there. So obviously, this sort of perspective reinforces sexist stereotypes about women's gentleness, right? Okay, so the third main strain here would be postmodernist feminism, and in this perspective, gender is a social construction, right? It varies across space and time, and so here we have some examples of soldiers behaving in a rather feminine way, right? Both U.S. and Nazi German soldiers, right? So postmodern feminists would say basically that you really can't make generalizations about what it is to be male or female, because these things vary. These things are not fixed. These are just basically ideas. These are just things that people came up with, stories. So, Goldstein, who wrote the textbook I No Longer Assign, who is in fact a man, asks, why is there this puzzle? Why is it that there's a near universal gendering of war? And he writes, across cultures and through time, the selection of men as potential combatants and of women for feminine war support roles has helped shape the war system. And so here's the stereotypical example of it, right? The man is the soldier and the woman is the helpful nurse, right? In wartime. So to address Goldstein's question, and he's wonderful, I don't mean to trash him, he's a nice guy. If you look at it, there have actually been women warriors since ancient times, right? Here we have the pre-dynastic Egyptian goddess of war and weaving, suckling crocodiles, no less, right? If you go back to ancient Greece and Rome, ancient India, right, you can find Kali, the destroyer, and Athena, the goddess of war, right? In Dahomey, in West Africa, in what is today Benin, there was the famous wing of the Royal Military comprised of women that's pictured here. And at times, the women's wing of the Royal Military was a third of the entire military. During the U.S. Civil War, there were there were dozens anyway, of women that we know of who disguised themselves as men and fought, either on the side of the Union or the Confederacy, right? And here are examples of just two. This woman was actually Cuban, and she's got a fake mustache on. In the First World War, so 100 plus years ago, you had women combatants in Russia, fighting in Russia, and they were called the Russian Women's Battalions of Death. That was the formal name. Here are some pictures of them. And then, of course, in the Second World War, Russia was famous, this time it was the Soviet Union, Russia was famous for its female fighter pilots. Now, a lot of the countries in World War II had female pilots, but the Soviets were unique in that their women pilots dropped bombs and fired back. Right, so they were fighter pilots. They weren't just flying. And apparently the Germans called them the night witches because they never got any sleep. They were continually bombing the Germans, and so the Germans couldn't rest. So after the Second World War, you'll find women fighters in quite a variety of anti-colonial movements such as the Vietnam War, right? The Vietnam War of Independence, also various secessionist wars, and Vietnam is just one example. I mean, you can point to many. Whether these were particularly empowering for women and whether it was particularly good for the cause, we will discuss in more detail later. But around the world, you find the image of the militant Madonna, which, it just kind of unnerves me to see babies tugging at Kalashnikovs or whatever that is. But it's a trope that was popular throughout the late 20th century, right, of mother and combatant. So we know that women actually have been warriors, are warriors, but for the most part, Goldstein's right that for the most part, women's involvement in war has been in the role of support. Right? And he goes through the description of women in war as mother, sweetheart, nurse, right? And I think these covers of sheet music from World War I illustrate that nicely, and this last one seems to have rolled all three into one. One could ask whether these roles have really changed, right? So for the most part, most women's involvement in war probably still is along the lines of mother, sweetheart, nurse. So some of the other supporting roles that women have played historically, right? You probably learned about Molly Pitcher back in elementary school, right? So providing relief to the troops, water girl, camp followers, right? So these are pictures of laundresses, but camp followers could be women, could be men, often were children. So they were people who followed the army wherever they went. And of course, this was the days before, Navy ships or cargo planes flew them off to the other side of the globe. So they would follow the troops and take care of their needs as maids, porters, nurses, laundresses, and of course, sometimes sex workers, right? Although not all sex workers were camp followers. And here are some World War II era sex worker propaganda. Victory girls were basically, I want to say, prostitutes light or patriotic putting out, right? So girls were encouraged to improve the morale of the soldiers by being very nice to them when they were home on furlough. Right? Pulling for victory, right? I believe some might call it, well, I was going to do another pulling joke, but we won't go there. Your mothers might be listening. So, fundraisers, that's another thing that women have typically done in wartime. Right? And I know that most of this is from the United States. That's because the reading that I used to assign focused on the U.S. for this part. Ladies' aid societies, right? Another category of fundraising, but, also providing material support for the troops. The American Women's Voluntary Service Group would be one example of such. So you can see they're providing delicious cakes for the soldiers. Here we have, and this would have been the segregation days, here we have obviously the African Americans wing buy war bonds and Marilyn Monroe entertaining the troops. So when we turn to the next set of slides, I'm going to talk about the readings you had on Jammu Kashmir. And in this particular part of India, for the most part, women's role was as helpers. You'll see that there was one exception that she talks about in the book, but for the most part, women were in and continue to be in these sort of helpmeet positions. And that ends part 1.